My name is Daniel Keohane and I'm the Research Director at Fride, a foreign affairs think tank.
Okay. And why or how did you become hooked to the European Union?
Well, I suppose it goes back to, in a way I'm a child of the Maastricht Treaty. I entered university in 1993, so just after Maastricht was signed. The single market obviously had come on board, freedom of movement, and I had the opportunity to have an Erasmus year, an exchange year, while I was at university in Dublin. And I ended up studying for a year in Germany at the University of Heidelberg. So I suppose that was the start of my pro-Europeanness, if you want.
And what did Europe look like back in the 90s?
Well, it was a bit different. I mean, for one thing, we didn't have so much cheap air travel in those days. That was a relatively new idea. So the idea of visiting other countries was much more exciting and distant, particularly for me coming from Ireland, which is a peripheral island of the continent. These days we take it for granted, the idea of moving around Europe, being able to live, work, travel very easily. But actually in the early 90s that was a relatively new thing. Obviously the last few years have been very difficult, that goes without saying. It's been very challenging to get over this economic crisis. It's been very difficult for the politics of the European Union. We know what might happen in the European Parliament elections in May, that a number of more Eurosceptical or Europhobic parties might gain seats, all of that sort of thing. So right at this very moment there are lots of reasons to be a bit pessimistic. On the other hand, one can make an argument that, well, the Eurozone hasn't broken up yet. While the economy is not doing as well in general terms as we would like, there are some signs of improvement. We have managed to integrate in some areas because of the fiscal treaty. We realise we will have to talk again about perhaps having more integration in the future. So not everything is bad. And I think looking to the future, there are actually a few reasons to be even optimistic for Europe's future. Although I take it that at this very moment in time, the political reality is a very difficult time for many European citizens. If we look to the world in 2030, I think there's a few big trends we should consider. One is the way the global economy is changing. We're all aware of economic power shifting from Europe and the United States to China, India, Brazil, and so on. I mean, according to some estimates, the non-OECD world, the non-rich club world of today will account for less of global GDP by the non-OECD world will account for more of global GDP by 2030 than the OECD world. So that's one big change. Most demographic growth, something like 97% of it over the next 20 years, will occur also in the non-OECD world. And we're seeing increasing patterns of South-South trade. So the global economy is changing. We're going to have a very large middle class by 2030. Over half the world's population will be classified as middle class. We're going to have more urbanization. All of that is going to change consumption patterns, and most of that growth in population and economic growth will be taking place really in Asia, in East Asia in particular. So that is going to have a profound effect on resources. It's going to raise very interesting questions about the challenges of things like climate change. Trade patterns are going to change, supply chain patterns are going to change, but there will be ongoing interdependence. I think that's a very, very key point. But then linked to that is the question of rising powers. How might China, India, Brazil, how will a more multipolar world, as the experts call it, how will that change global politics? Will the global system simply look more Western? And I think that's a very, very open question and a very debatable question, because obviously if you look at things like GDP growth, military spending, research and development, demographic growth, it's clear that China is rising. It's clear that India is rising. It's clear that Brazil is rising. However, we should not assume that the current projections, that these trends will be linear. Because of course China, Brazil, India, they're huge countries, huge, with massive domestic socioeconomic challenges. The demand for growth to sustain social peace in these countries is huge. So we cannot assume that they will pursue very smooth paths to the future. So in some ways I'm less concerned about the rise of China, India, Brazil, their growing strength. I'd actually have big questions about their potential weaknesses. And of course, what knock-on effect will that have for global politics and the global system as we know it? Look, I don't think anyone would say that the European Union is a very geopolitical actor yet. because I mean,
It certainly has the ambitions.
yeah, I mean, certainly that ambition is there, but the reality is the European Union is not a superstate. So in some ways it's unfair to compare the European Union with China or with the United States. We have to see it as a collective actor of 28 governments. So it's quite a different animal. It's a unique animal in that respect. How well prepared is Europe for the future? Well, obviously our credibility at the moment has been quite damaged. However, in some respects we're quite well prepared for the future. For one thing, we're still the largest economy if you take the EU as a whole in the world. We're the largest trading bloc in the world. So, you know, the richest region, arguably the most peaceful region actually in the world. And I think where we really might have an advantage is, I mentioned earlier the shift in global power. What's interesting with that is how global governance may change. Because what you will see, and you see this for example on an issue like climate change, you have many more actors. It's not just that you have the growth, the rise of China. It's also that you have many non-state actors, cities, businesses, you name it. In other words, global governance, global politics is going to become much more complex. You know, consider the way a group of cities, the C40, leads on the environment at the moment. Now, the European Union is used to the idea of trying to cope with different policy issues at different levels, at a regional European level, between member states, with partners like China and the United States, with non-state actors, whether it be cities or NGOs or businesses. And what you will see is on many big issues, different coalitions on different issues. Now we're used to that idea within the European Union, but in many ways global governance will start to look a bit like the way the European Union works. So in some respects, because we're more used to that, that actually could be an advantage for us. Well, I think there's two big factors to consider in the case of India and China, and then I'll come to Russia. In the case of India and China, what they most need is economic growth, and what they really need to sustain that economic growth is access to resources, particularly energy, and access to trade, of course. You know, in 20 years, most Middle Eastern oil will be sold eastwards towards India and China. Already a lot of it is. We know this already. So their domestic challenge will be huge. But along with their domestic challenges, they both have serious disputes with some of their neighbours, including each other, by the way. They still have an unresolved border dispute along the Himalayan border, their shared Himalayan border, which they're trying to manage, in fairness. Look at China's tensions with Japan at the moment. Look at the tensions in the South China Sea. Look at how the situation in Afghanistan could affect India's security with Pakistan, etc. So they are in a very different security environment to say what Europeans are in today. I think Russia's challenges are quite different in some respects because they actually don't have demographic growth, quite the opposite at the moment. They're very dependent on petrochemicals and other fossil fuels for their economy, for their economic growth. And of course it'll be interesting to see, for example, what impact shale gas has on Russia's growth prospects, shale gas that is in other countries. And of course, I think in reality, the Russians still feel quite strategically threatened by, not only by NATO, as traditionally has been the case, but in some respects by China as well. You know, Russia's eastern provinces are becoming quite dependent on Chinese economic growth. Central Asia is becoming quite dependent on Chinese economic growth. So this raises new challenges for Russia. Even though Moscow and Beijing are currently very friendly, I think over the long term, that relationship could become more complicated. There's a lot of potential for interstate conflict in East Asia. I think that's obvious to say, looking at the border disputes, the maritime disputes in the East China Sea, in the South China Sea, and so on. That could spiral out of control. That raises big questions, of course, about US and China. That's the really big question looking to the future. Would the US and China ever go to war? I'm not sure that's likely, but of course a defence planner would never rule it out. And that is a huge question, I think, for Europeans. How do they manage that US-China relationship? But along with that, there's our own broad neighbourhood, which currently is very turbulent. You know, you think of Syria, you think of Libya, you look at Ukraine, you look at Georgia's dispute with Russia. There's a lot of trouble in our neighbourhood. And of course, we're quite dependent on our neighbourhood for energy. So it does directly affect our interests, along with the geographic fact of migration and so on. So yes, there's a lot of potential for trouble.
This instability in the region, will it last for some time, or what do you think?
Well, I see no reason why it would not last for some time, frankly, because, you know, for example, if you look at countries in North Africa or in the Levant, I think we're looking at very long transition phases. I think we're looking at lots of ups and downs, and not just because of sectarian tensions, not just because of the current difficulties of the transitions, but also because of longer term demographic trends. You know, they are looking at very large population growth and increasingly resource shortages, particularly fresh water. And this will create new, huge socioeconomic challenges that I'm not sure they will cope with very easily. So I think we're bound to see trouble in the future.
And you say yourself that the European defense policy has been more noticed for its absence than its presence on the world stage.
Yeah. Okay, what I mean by that is if you take the EU as a whole and you look at 500 million people, 14 trillion euro economy, roughly 200 billion euro a year spent on defence, you don't see that through the EU defence policy. You see it a bit more maybe through NATO, actually, in fairness. If you look at what how large the European presence has been relatively in Afghanistan compared with what the Europeans have done through the EU. I think maybe another way to think about this issue is there is a clear trend of Europeans increasingly having to act alone or at least take a lead on crises in their neighbourhood. You think about Lebanon, Israel 2006, Europeans acted through the UN actually. You think about Russia, Georgia in 2008, they acted through the EU. You think about Libya in 2011, France and Britain ended up leading through NATO. You think about Mali in 2013, France acted nationally but then with some European support and indeed some American support as well. The point is, whether or not it's through the EU is one question, but there is a trend, a strategic trend of Europeans having to cope increasingly on their own or take the lead on a lot of crises in their neighbourhood. And add to the fact that the neighbourhood is very turbulent, and that suggests to me that there's a strategic case for arguing that Europeans will have to do much more in the future. It is true that defence policy is not a priority for most national politicians at the moment, for a host of reasons. One, the economic crisis is naturally the priority. Two, defence policy using military force has lost a lot of credibility, is unpopular. Because of Iraq, because of Afghanistan, which are perceived to have been failures. I mean, look at the difficulty David Cameron, the British Prime Minister, had at convincing his Parliament to intervene in Syria last year. And Britain would not be considered hesitant normally about using military force. It would be a leader on defence policy in Europe. As you know, a lot of European cooperation tends to be born out of crises. Indeed, EU defence policy in many ways was born out of the Balkan Wars in the 1990s, for example. And, you know, this is the big danger that unfortunately things may have to go very wrong for us to realise that we really need to cooperate much more closely. That would be my big fear. What thing will it be that will go very wrong? I don't know.
Apart from defence policies, do you think Europe in general could become a leading continent in the 21st century, despite the current crisis?
Yes. In a nutshell, I do. Because as I said earlier, we shouldn't forget that we're still extremely rich. You know, yes, China, India and others are rising, but their per capita income is way, way, way below even that of Greece, let alone that of the average EU citizen. That's one point. We're a very large trading bloc, which gives us a certain weight as it is already. And indeed, if we emerge from the crisis intact and we manage to create some growth preferably as well, I think we'll emerge with a lot of credibility in the end. And who's to say in 10 years' time Europe could be growing a bit and China is not growing so much, which will look more attractive for investors then. So there's lots of reasons why Europeans can be confident about the future. The trick will be, I think where we're going to have a big difficulty, is can we really develop a sense of common European interests? You know, we talk a lot about European values in our foreign policy and in our message to the rest of the world. But we do talk a lot about interests, but it's usually an amalgam of national interests. We're not very good at trying to develop a common European sense of our interests. And the fact is, if we want to get things done in the world, you know, if you're in Beijing or Washington, you don't care what Britain alone or France alone or Germany alone thinks, but you would care what 28 governments acting together would think.
So what would be the solution, going to a federal state?
Well, that's the kind of logical solution, but I don't think that's going to happen, frankly. I just don't see Europe becoming a federal superstate in the next 20 years. I mean, who knows? But I'm quite sceptical that that would happen. But looking at the way the European Union operates today, I think the trick is to try, in particular the bigger countries like France, Britain and Germany, The real trick is, can those three develop a better understanding of their common interests when it comes to foreign policy and our place in the world? Because at the moment Germany is quite focused on Russia, France is quite focused on North Africa and the Middle East, and Britain is still is focused on those issues, but it's also still quite focused on the US agenda as well, for very understandable reasons. Can they find a way to satisfy each other's strategic interests and work together more effectively? Some foreign policy areas, the institutions are very powerful, like development policy, trade policy, climate, and so on. But ultimately, you know, in defence policy, which is the most costly part of foreign policy, arguably, both financially and politically, that's still strictly intergovernmental, and I don't see that changing. I don't see this idea of a European army happening anytime soon. I don't think any government wants to give up its sovereignty on defence policy. But on the other hand, we don't have the resources to do very much unless we combine our military resources. That's the basic conundrum. I think it's obvious to say that we expect more Eurosceptic or anti-EU parties to be elected to the parliament. So there'll be more extremists in some ways. It'll be a more extreme parliament than your average national parliament, actually, in that respect. And that's one of the things I find very curious about the European Parliament, is that, you know, in many ways, if you look at national results, it's surprising in a way that more extreme parties have not been elected in national elections since the economic crisis broke out, or have not done as well as you might expect, but we do expect them to do well in the European Parliament elections. Will that have a huge impact on the leadership? I still expect the leadership to come from the biggest parties, from the EPP, from the Socialists, from the Liberals. Well, look, at their first priority has to be economic growth. It's that simple. Now, if you're asking me instead what their foreign policies priorities should be, I mean, they obviously have to care about trade. I think we have to care more about energy security, and particularly where are we going to get our energy in the future, both internally and externally. And in the end, we still have to care about upholding international law, supporting global governance. The European Union, in the end, it's not just that it's a peace project, it's a project based on law. You know, the European Union is about the force of law, not the law of force. So we have to think very hard, how can we keep developing global governance? How can we temper geopolitical competition, like the US-China relationship, and encourage cooperative relationships? Because that's ultimately what the European Union is about.
The rule of law is not something that's really on the agenda now, but
no.
It might become a very strategic asset, let's say.
Yes,
of the EU.
exactly,
Yeah.
exactly.
Okay, thank you very much for your time.
Thank you.